Good afternoon, and welcome to season 4, episode 6 of Green Table Talk. I am Latricia Adams, the founder, CEO, and president of Young, Gifted, and Green, and we are so excited for a myriad of reasons. But today, thank you to those who have joined us virtually, but we have to celebrate today. We're in a very powerful building today. We're on the Hill live from the Rayburn Office House building. I want to first acknowledge our partners. So thank you to our partners at EDF Action, the Climate Action Campaign. And I would be absolutely remiss not to say thank you to the staff with Congressman Raul Grijalva, which supported us not only with what we will talk about this afternoon, but also with securing this space. It is important as we are in Women's History Month, in lieu of Black History Month, that we are able to convene to talk about something so important today, which is the legacy of the late, great Congressman McEachin. So I am so excited for this phenomenal host of panelists that we have this afternoon that will talk about how we can truly reach environmental justice for all, not just nationally, but in our own backyards, in our own respective communities. But before we actually dive into this phenomenal panel, we're going to do EJ right today. So before we get started, we want to pay homage to who are now ancestors in this movement that made this possible for us to continue to carry the torch. So in the month of March the 22nd to be specific, is when the Environmental Justice for All Act was actually reintroduced to and dearly include the namesake of Congressman Don McEachin. And so before we begin, it is my honor and privilege to introduce Ms. Leonina Arizmendi, who will provide some spoken word to pay homage to our ancestors in the EJ movement. Right.
Thank you so much, Latricia. Thank you for inviting me. I am Leonina Arizmendi. I'm one of the lead prevention ambassadors here in DC for Young, Gifted, and Green. And I am the Environmental Justice Artivist Fellow for Social Arts and Culture. And I previously lived in Richmond, Virginia. And I'm really sorry to say that I did not have the privilege to meet Representative Donald McEachin personally. Although in this life our paths did not cross, I know that his work not only touched each and every one of you here, paying respects and speaking on his legacy, but also all Virginians, and I dare say the world, because that is at the heart of the environmental and social justice movements that he championed to save the world. So we take on that revolutionary notion and motion that he left us with to keep fighting for Mother Earth and its people. I am originally from Uruguay in South America, and the environmental justice movements across Latin America. There is a call and response given as we speak in honor of those who are no longer with us. And that is the inspiration for this poem, which I wrote in a writing excursion in Miami Botanical Gardens earlier this month. It is called Presente. Is that okay? It is called Presente. Presente. Presente in the present tense means that you who are considered gone, just for a moment, descend down to the earth whom you embraced for so long that she eventually embraced you back to her. Presente is a prayer for fortaleza, strength that will keep us walking that talk with our heads held high, despite las tristezas, the grief that comes with only having tu presencia, your presence, when we call your name in the journey to freedom, independencia for people and earth. Presente is a call for resistencia. Now, if you would indulge me, I would like to do this call with you. So when I say Donald McEachin's name, you would say presente with me. Y'all want to try it? Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. So Donald McEachin, presente. Donald McEachin, presente. Donald McEachin, presente. Gracias.
All right. Thank you so much again, Leonina, for grounding us in this sacred space that we are convening in today. So without further ado, while each of these respective panelists, we have some champions in the house. I'm not going to read these bios for these folks because we'll be here all day and all night, and we do have to leave at some point. So I'm going to allow each respective panelist just to do a short introduction of themselves, and then we'll go with our first panel question. So beginning with Kristen, followed by Michelle, if you can just do a brief intro, who you are, and why you're here, and then we'll get this party started.
The least favorite thing for me to talk about is myself, but I'm Chris Espinosa. I grew up in a very small town in Southern California, and worked in Hispanic civil rights advocacy for some time, and found a passion for environmental policy and discovered the connection between environmental injustice and communities that I had spent years working with. And through a long meandering story, had an amazing opportunity to work for one of the most incredible, powerful members of Congress that I've ever met, Representative Grijalva, in his capacity as chair on the House Committee on Natural Resources. And I got to work alongside him as he crafted this amazing visionary strategy of not just a comprehensive environmental justice bill, but a process for remaking legislation through participatory policymaking with communities at the table through every step of that process. I now work as legislative director for climate and energy at Earth Justice, and I'm happy to be a part of this conversation because it's a very near and dear effort and cause to my heart.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Miss. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Mm-hmm. How's that? My name is Michelle Roberts. I'm the National Co-Coordinator for the Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform. It's a very long name. Some would say you should have a shorter name. Our shorter name is EJHA, but our affiliates affectionately name themselves the Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform for a reason. And they named themselves that on the heels of the Toxic Substance Control Act debacle, TSCA, which basically eliminated reference to that of toxic hotspots in their communities. And so speaking for themselves, they were formerly the Fence Line Working Group, as they were formerly, but now Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform. I am a trained scientist. I'm a biologist. I'm a wetlands biologist by training. I have worked in all the scopes of water. Mostly toxics was my largest body of work. I worked on disasters, and I currently work on disasters today as it relates to disaster policy. But prior to becoming an advocate, I had my hands, fingers, and toes, if you will, in these toxics, no pun intended, by actually testing that of the waste the waste from that of heavy industries going into our stormwaters and sewers, if you will, in our communities. And early on, before there was, quote, that citizens testing and all of those things, did those types of, I actually worked with communities in the late 80s and early 90s to really identify the challenges that were happening in their community and then try to really figure that out and figure out a way to get the remedies and the reforms that they needed from the local, state, and federal governments. I also have a background in working with our communities in the Gulf and had the privilege of serving the 5 Gulf states on the heels of Katrina, Rita, Gustav, Ike, and BP as our Gulf States Human Rights Working Group co-coordinator in helping to organize those communities. Currently working with, as I said, the Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform. Our communities are fence line to some of the nation's most egregious operations. How did I get into chemicals? I'm from the chemical capital of the world. Those of you who don't know, it's the state that our dear president is from, and that is Wilmington, Delaware. In addition to that, I just quickly want to say justice is a big part of my world because of the fact that when I was in second grade, Dr. King was assassinated, and my city, our state, was under martial law for 19 months, 18 months on the hard, 9 on the soft, if you will, after the assassination. So I really owe a great deal of respect to my second grade teacher just last, who actually challenged all of us in class that I'm telling you that it will be all right, but it was going to be up to us to really make this world a better place. And I took that very seriously, especially coming from parents who were in school and were there, that our state was part of the Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, and they were in that segregated class. I'm happy to be here with you all today.
Ooh, so y'all, I told you I didn't need to do a full bio. You needed to hear from the sources itself. This is a powerful list of speakers to speak to something that is so important. I wanted to, before we get into the first question, I wanted to talk about how inclusive this particular process was with the Environmental Justice for All Act. So quick story, I promise it'll be quick, how we got connected to this piece of legislation is we actually saw this really dope platform where you can put in comments on whatever you wanted to say with any line of the bill. I had never seen anything like that before. In fact, when I first saw it, I was like, is this real? Or is this coming from like a nonprofit? Or no, like literally it was the most participatory platform that I had ever seen as far as making recommendations and giving feedback in real time on a federal bill. On top of that, it was annotated. So a lot of times when we think about distressed communities, far too often the language that you use is not accessible in a myriad of ways. Things were annotated, so things that you kind of didn't understand, poof, you could see like a pop-up that kind of explains like what I mean. It was the most robust and operative word inclusive process that I had seen, and really wishing that we can see that same level of engagement, that really positive utilization of technology to make things more accessible. So I wanted to make sure that I lifted that up. It was probably one of the most, it was the entry point for our organization, being very young at that time, to be able to have a say-so in federal legislation. I'm excited to say 100% of the recommendations that came from Young, Gifted, and Green appeared almost verbatim to the T in this legislation. So when we bring that back into community, especially with young people, it shows the power of the democratic process. It doesn't start and end with voting. It starts with us having a voice in what governs us as a society, what essentially gives us resources that we need to get to a place of not just environmental justice, but restorative justice as well. So I wanted to make sure that I celebrate that, that I uplift that. That's how I came to know Chris. That was like, hey, this is awesome that you all have given this feedback. I'm like, wow, y'all, this is really real. Somebody from this office is reaching back out to us. So I wanted to just celebrate that and frame that. So getting into the actual panel discussion. So with the Environmental Justice for All Act, it aims to address disproportionate harms faced by frontline communities, which we know, unfortunately, are majority Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and communities in economic distress. I want to make sure I was clear on what that meant. So harms faced by frontline communities through monitoring, we in the Congress building, so that was just a buzz. Through monitoring, enforcement, and remediation requirements. So I actually want to start with Michelle. So with the provisions that are uplifted in the Environmental Justice for All Act, what are some potential impacts that we can see on the ground? And what I mean by that, even though this is a robust congressional bill, there's still things that you can put into place back at home, whether it be at the local level, where it be at the state level. So starting with Michelle, can you share some insight on some things that you've seen that have inspired work on the ground from the Environmental Justice for All Act?
Yes, thank you for that. And we too at the EJHA, Latricia, our communities, we had a call with Brother Chris Espinosa and Corey Solo at the time, who were the staff for Ms. McEachin and Grijalva, and many of our communities were saying the same thing. I said that. It's in there. My words are in there. And so what that means is we're now seeing even locally communities who are creating that of cumulative impacts bills, right? Where cumulative impacts was a big issue to them. The effects of all of these permits coming in and the disproportionate health effects that were in their communities and the lack of infrastructure, if you will, or access to resources for infrastructure. This bill and these things helped with that, or addressing that of toxics, how it is that we start talking about the need for safer chemicals and safer processes, and challenging our local states and communities to do better at permitting, right? And the regulatory process. People are working on and working to actually the private right to sue, thinking about what that actually looks like in their local spaces and places. Where we have communities in, like when we think about the Regenesis Project in South Carolina, where communities are taking their power in their hands to bring to their communities what they need, like health clinics, access to education in a better way. All of these things matter, right? And if that's not enough, we want to say we the people, because it was a people's bill, actually influenced the president to really make sure that environmental justice was fundamentally centered in the White House, to a point that there is a federal advisory council in the White House addressing environmental justice and climate, that the White House has centered this throughout the full federal family and must address a plan. Not only just say that we're doing this, but have a plan. So it took us from local to federal, and people see themselves in it. It's not something that will happen overnight. But what we as people of color and poor folk, our poor white brothers and sisters also know that it takes that, all we need is that spark of light and resolve to turn the page, to bring our solutions, and then it's on.
Ooh, that was a word. And something in there that really resonated with me. You know, I always talk about I used to be a teacher, even though I'm a teacher for life. actually working with the Environmental Justice for All Act, we learned a lot through that process. So while we have a question later for Chris, one of the things that really resonated with us as an organization and the community members that we work with is having a deeper understanding of NEPA, which, if you're not familiar, the National Environmental Protection Act, and really understanding that part where you talked about the right to sue. We know that oftentimes in our communities, with our legislators, with our agencies, they're not moved by a moral compass. Sometimes you got to take them to court. And so part of that process with not only amplifying your voice like from your own narrative, but it was very thoughtful with understanding. Again, I'm gonna keep saying this over and over again, being connected and having access to democracy was also so paramount in the process, even with us being able to not be afraid to dive into policy. It's kind of scary if you're not familiar with that. Oftentimes you feel like maybe I'm not well versed enough, or I'm not an attorney, I'm not in a policy wonk or whatnot, but your narrative, you're the expert of your own community. So we're gonna shift gears just a little bit because I do wanna touch on NEPA. So Chris, a key part of the bill is to both protect and strengthen the National Environmental Protection Act, which again is short for NEPA. So what are the current threats to NEPA, and how would this bill protect largely Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and economically distressed communities?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's at the core of not just this bill, but the process that created the bill. The National Environmental Policy Act is a law that requires agencies taking major federal actions to consider the impacts of those actions and to take public comment and recommendations on whether those actions should be pursued, whether alternatives should be considered, and how the adverse impacts of those actions can be mitigated. And so it was a groundbreaking law when it was enacted, but it also, as it exists right now, doesn't reflect the inequities that we see across communities throughout this country. And so as the bill began to develop and these conversations started taking shape, and the members of Congress, Representative McEachin and Ranking Member Grijalva and others would meet with communities, the feedback that they would hear is, yes, we know that this decision is coming. We don't know the details because it's buried in some agency website that is hard to navigate, hard to understand, in dense language. We find out that there's one hearing, on this issue that's going to impact our communities. And that hearing is 3 states away. And there's no ability whatsoever to weigh in publicly beyond that. And so what the NEPA components of the Environmental Justice for All Act do is they create additional responsibilities on agencies taking these actions to meaningfully engage with communities impacted by the decisions that they make, to inform communities proactively, to hold public input opportunities in the impacted communities, not in regional offices states away that are inaccessible, and a number of other really important protections that weren't considered when that law was first enacted. Now, even in its current form, NEPA is under threat constantly. There was a huge conversation that continues now in the halls of Congress and within the administration around quote unquote permitting reform. And what some mean when they use the term permitting reform, particularly industry, is removing those limited public input requirements that exist now from the permitting and federal action process at all. There are some that believe that communities should not have any input whatsoever in these decisions. So the NEPA provisions in the bill were groundbreaking, but one of the beautiful things that happened with the process that Representative McEachin and Representative Grijalva envisioned to create this bill, Representative Grijalva once said, the process has to reflect the aspirations of the policy. If we're saying that public input is essential to communities, then we have to include public input in the process of how we develop this bill. And that's exactly what happened. So in my view, this is one of the most core and essential components of the EJ for All Act. The whole bill is critical, but the NEPA provisions in particular are essential. And, as we're recognizing all of the amazing, talented community members and staff and members of Congress that work together to develop this groundbreaking piece of legislation, I will just give a shout out to Matthew Muragi, who is now the Deputy Staff Director of the House Committee on Natural Resources for the Democrats. He is the authoritative NEPA expert in this country. And Matthew had the difficult, arduous task of translating community aspirations into legislative language. So if any of you get the chance, talk to Matthew Muragi about the NEPA process.
That was an amazing journey. So now you see why I said that we learned so much in this process, and it made it so accessible. And sometimes, depending on who you have to work with on the Hill, sometimes people try to make you feel dumb and try to make you feel less than. And even from an accessibility, from a spiritual perspective, it felt good. It didn't feel like it was pandering, which happens a lot when you engage with communities. And just to keep reiterating the fact that you saw your words. Oh my gosh, you literally saw your words. We could like we said that. And, again, with the NEPA component, it did provide some educational access as well for people who were completely oblivious that this even existed. So that part that you talked about, like with making it just really digestible for everyone, whether you are just like my grandma from South Memphis, or you are an attorney from Georgetown. It's accessible for everyone to understand what your rights are, and just being essentially in a position knowing that you can fight back when there are things that are in your community that you simply do not want. So thank you for sharing that journey. And yes, shout out to Matthew. Yes, we love to see it. We need those experts that are really willing to engage with community to ensure that that level of accessibility is consistent. So shifting gears a bit, and we've been touching on this quite a bit. So also with this bill, it's so many good things in this bill. The bill requires that federal agencies consider cumulative impacts. And we say cumulative impacts, that means things that happen from a public health perspective. So unfortunately, especially when you live in already overburdened communities, you have a body burden, meaning that from birth, even in the womb, to be quite frank, when you are exposed to a litany of toxins and chemicals and other aspects of pollution, it lives in your body in some instances forever. We know with PFAS, for example, is forever. right? Even with childbirthing people in chest milk and breast milk, they have found plastics, right? And so when we think about this bill, the level of intentionality to include and consider cumulative impacts as well as how those impacts inform decision making. So starting with Michelle and then followed by Chris, how can community voices, specifically local knowledge and progressive health-based professional organizations, we cannot leave the public health people out of these conversations. How can this be best incorporated as we talk about implementing or putting in aspects of cumulative impacts into a bill such as the Environmental Justice for All Act? So we'll start with Michelle and then follow up with Chris.
Thank you for that question. One other group that we can't leave out and an agency is Department of Housing with HUD. When we think about that of health, environment, housing, and you think about how, especially people of color and the trajectory of our living, we just very quickly did a report in Delaware where on the heels of Beau Biden dying because our communities were never listened to. Every time they said, as Chris was saying, we have these health disparities and we're sick. They were told that it was their lifestyle. And we had enough. And so in Delaware, for example, we looked at that whole area of racial redlining. And as I said, the Brown versus Board of Education, all of these things were part and parcel to what we're talking about for the cumulative impacts in our communities, right? And we did a report and compared our communities, because back in Delaware, growing up, we would say they wouldn't do that out in Greenville, where the senator, at that point, the senator lived. Now he was the vice president by the time we wrote the report, and Beau died. And we compared our communities and our people dying en masse to Beau's death, right? The world stopped for one. Meanwhile, our communities were overburdened, even with respect to the challenge in the military with the burn fields. Our folks have been saying all along that I'm exposed to these burn fields. And in no disrespect, and in all full respect to our president, and we say this all the time, we did it tastefully. But we compared our communities who have been subjected to burn fields, fence line, and everything else, right, Latricia?
Yes, ma'am.
And we were never able to talk about cumulative impacts then. But now we can talk about it, right? The good news is now we can talk about it. And this is so important, and that's why it's so important for even HUD to be part of this, because they all played a role in racial redlining at a point that if we're going to be really talking about justice and instilling and bringing in and making our communities whole, as Brother Delma Bennett would say from Mossville, Louisiana, then we must look at the entire aspect of these communities and look at how they were made disproportionate in order to bring the healing mechanism in of cumulative impacts, to which then, thankfully, we heard from Mr. Grijalva and Mr. McEachin both heard this and also experienced it in their own lives, right? To understand where our communities were coming from, so.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's, when you really think about it, a lot of these decisions around pollution controls in this country, whether it's through the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act, people assume that there's a process in place that informed science-based decisions are made as to whether a project or a facility is safe for the communities that live there. And the reality is that's That's not quite how our environmental protective laws work right now. And that's why we need the Environmental Justice for All Act and the cumulative impacts provisions that are in that bill. The way EPA evaluates a permit, say for a power plant facility that is emitting toxins into the air, is yes, they do informed science, and they analyze that project and they make science-based decisions on what is considered an acceptable level of exposure. But when you look at the communities where these facilities are placed and you just drive around and you see not just that facility that's being proposed, but 15 other facilities that are emitting the same toxins in that community, and you look at the cumulative effect of that pollution burden on that community, there is no way in good conscience that you could conclude that that is safe for those communities. And so that's what the Environmental Justice for All Act does, is it changes these laws to take into consideration the cumulative pollution burden on these communities when they make permitting decisions, whether it's through the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act. And based on that cumulative effect, make decisions on whether or not that facility will be permitted. And so I'm glad that you brought up what you did, Michelle, because I think back to Beau Biden's tragic death. And I think back to how deeply that impacted now President Biden. And I remember during the Obama administration, when he was vice president, him launching this amazing effort, the Biden moonshot, to solve cancer. And if you look at communities across this country, and Representative McEachin, Representative Grijalva went to Virginia, went to California, went to Louisiana, and really experienced these cumulative pollution burdens through the eyes of the communities that live there. I wish I could go back to those days in the Obama administration and tell the vice president, your moonshot is with the Environmental Justice for All Act. That is the quickest mechanism to relieving a crisis of cancer clusters throughout America, relieving a disproportionate burden of asthma, respiratory diseases, other chronic illnesses that are directly correlated with the pollution that we see in those same very communities. So that is another area, Latricia, that I would say of all of the provisions of EJ for All and everything that it does, I consider the cumulative impact provisions to be absolutely core and central to what this bill accomplishes.
Can I just add one quick piece, and thank you for that. You know, we took a big hit when we did that report because it's not easy to come out and compare your EJ community to the vice president and, you know, and basically say, when I came, you didn't answer me, and yet everyone is concerned about the vice president's son, right? And you're saying, but you weren't concerned about my son or my daughter in such a way. I also want to say to our friends from the environmental community, and as we are thinking about, you know, like those states that we should be in and the ways that we should do, you know, I was here in Washington, D.C., right here working with the grassroots, and people knew that because everybody from Delaware, you know who's from Delaware. We always let you know, right? I've been down here for 25 years, almost 25 years, but I let you know I'm originally from Wilmington, Delaware, but I'm based here in D.C., like Joe Biden. We're two, but all to say, none of my environmental friends on the Cancer Moonshot group came anywhere near me asking, can you be on this committee with us? Can we talk to you about this? Because after all, you're from Delaware and so is Vice President Biden. We've got to be careful when we get appointed to these fancy spaces and places that we consider fancy to be in, because at the other end is somebody's life. At the end of your nice outfit, suit, and seat is somebody's life that's hanging in the rafters that could be here today and gone today. And so that's why we penned that report, because we weren't in the rooms with the people who were sitting with the vice president, although we were from the vice president's state.
Yeah. And it's also, put some respect on Black and brown people. Our ancestors and elders are the founders of this movement. And I think far too often when we are in spaces, when we talk about environment, it's co-opted. The representation that you see on this panel is a representation of who started this movement. However, I'd be remiss not to acknowledge how under-resourced we are while still being the face of those communities that bear the brunt each and every day from generation to generation. So you're absolutely right, Michelle. I think that it is imperative that when we do have these seats of influence, that we still maintain connection back to our community. We can't get so up in the clouds, right? So with your nose so far up in the air, as my granny would say, that you forget where you come from. And it's imperative that as we do this work, that we are not just carrying our narratives, but we have a role and responsibility to maintain the narratives of the people that we work for and with every day. So I thank you for sharing that. And then also, when we talk about environmental justice, it's not just what you do in the future to be proactive, it's the restorative part. And you can't talk about environmental justice if you don't talk about public health. At the end of the day, we want to improve the well-being of everyone. But we also have to grapple with those cumulative impacts of people who have chronic asthma. That's me. I was born with a sinus infection. How does that happen? I just came out the womb, but that's because my family is from a community where there's an oil refinery across the street. So we have to think about this holistically. I was on a panel earlier today. It's been a busy day, and it was a lady that talked about, as educator speaker, we talk about focusing on the whole child. When we talk about environmental justice, you have to talk about the whole person. You have to talk about the whole community. So I really thank you for those responses. Still within the same vein, around just some of the overlap that exists. So with this current administration, for the first time, even in the campaign trail, you heard the words environmental justice. Now, at first we were hearing like climate change. We're like, okay, but shout out to Al Gore in Tennessee. We had heard that before. But environmental justice, the terminology spoke truth to power, right? And so now we start to see entities like the WEJAC, or the White House Environmental Advisory Council. That's a mouthful, that both myself and Michelle have an honor to serve on. We do have an executive order that is focused on environmental justice. So with that, starting with Michelle and then with Chris, can you talk about some of the overlap that you see between the Environmental Justice for All Act and President Biden's Environmental Justice Executive Order?
Yes. What we see in the executive order is the fact that he really did listen. Not only did he listen to the people, he even put resources towards it, which is something far different from, we've had 40 years of people talking about environmental justice. And it was like on this piece of paper where we could just do the wave, right? And so we were doing the wave until we could get it there. And now, when we think about putting resources to it, and not only putting resources to it, making sure that agencies have responsibility to uphold what they're supposed to be there for. Now, this is not coming overnight, so don't stone me, right? But, when you look, and the last time I checked to see that $143 billion, roughly, has been allocated towards addressing harms, understanding we still have challenges, but have been allocated to addressing harms, and these harms have been laid out in this particular bill. That's huge. Now, the onus is on us to now take that and organize and work and run with our communities. The onus is on us to decide whether or not we're going to look at the glass half empty or half full. The onus is on us. And I know in the great state of Delaware, we have a representative by the name of Representative Larry Lambert, freshman representative who was actually part of our EJ community, who participated in the writing of the EJ for All Act as Joe Q. citizen, right? Then was so empowered by this, actually went on and ran the second time, because he ran once and lost, but ran the second time for a state representative using the platform from the Environmental Justice for All Act, Latricia. He's like, I'm going to be that EJ state senator, state representative. And he won. He's in a majority white district that is majority industry. Keep your prayers wrapped around that brother. Because he put his whole body and soul into this. And he is seeking to try to take what Mr. McEachin and Mr. Grijalva, which he said he had the privilege of meeting and being with both of them, and now anchoring this on the ground in a localized way, in a state that's called the chemical capital of the world, the PFAS state, right? Think about that. That's huge. And these are the types of things that are happening when we see that overlap and our communities pushing for their local elected officials to do more. We see that in South Carolina, Spartanburg, South Carolina. We're seeing it in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We're seeing it in New Jersey. We're seeing it in California. And we're seeing it, even our folks in Alaska are talking about how they make these things our communities are now pushing to make sure that they bring the remedy and redress to what is needed. Now, the one thing just quickly that is also necessary, and I would be remiss if I did not say this, we also, not all communities will be able to be resolved and remedied. Some people will have to leave where they are. It's unfortunate. But in those folks needing to leave, we need to understand that they need, and that also is addressed in the Grijalva bill, is that if you must be relocated, you gotta be made whole. You can't just give someone a house without health care and a bill. That's not relocation. That's relocation, that's not being made whole. We need to make sure that no one is left behind. And that's what the no one is left behind means for us in that bill.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think like I could sit up here and talk for hours about the synergies between this administration and its administrative actions to address environmental injustice and Ranking Member Grijalva's Environmental Justice for All Act. And if I were the president, I don't know if this happens, but I would have Raul Grijalva on speed dial when talking about environmental issues personally. But there are a lot of reasons why that happened, and why when you look at the considerable list of accomplishments from this administration to advance progress on environmental justice, you see a lot of synergy between that and what's in the EJ for All Act. Number one, communities were engaged in the process in developing the EJ for All Act. And what that meant was the conversations that they were having together around what their community's needs were in terms of policy redress were also translating to the conversations they were having with the campaigns and the incoming administration. So that's part of where that overlap is. I think another major part is when you look at the sponsors of the legislation, yes, it was Representative Grijalva and Representative McEachin as the original co-sponsors of the EJ for All Act in the House. Do you know who the original co-sponsor of the Senate version of the EJ for All Act was? It was Senator Kamala Harris, now Vice President Kamala Harris. So that's another reason why there's so much connective tissue there. If you look at the participants from the community in the EJ for All Act development process, and you go on to whitehouse.gov and you look at who sits on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, they look very similar. So, it is my belief that the EJ for All Act will become law. The question is, when will that happen? And what is going to determine that is how fiercely we advocate across this country to make sure that, yes, while we are seeing progress from the Biden administration through executive action is fleeting. One administration can pursue policies, another administration can overturn them. We need the durability of law and the lasting effect that comes with that. And how we get that is by passing the EJ for All Act into law. And so if there is one thing that you can do, everyone can go out, learn more about the EJ for All Act. There's a great website. It is democrats-naturalresources.house.gov. There's a wealth of information there to understand the policies, to understand what's in the bill, to understand how that has real practical implications in communities across this country. If you have never picked up the phone or sent an email to your member of Congress, now is the time. You do not have to be a policy expert to know that your community is being impacted by pollution and to want to see that change and to advocate with the people who represent you to create law that will change this country forever. And we can do it together. It can be as simple as picking up the phone, or it can be as committed as running for state legislature in Delaware and making cumulative impact state policy in your own state. There are so many ways that we can make the aspirations that the community has put into this bill into legislative and legal reality.
And can I just say one quick thing? None of the words, as far as we're concerned, in the EJ for All Act, AKA the People's Bill, they are non-negotiable. None of those words, there will be no redlining. See, I learned civics in school. There will be no redlining. There will be no negotiation. And Mr. Manchin, you need to go home because we're not having a discussion about the people's language. It's our language. It's what we want. It's what we demand. And it's no bottom line, no weakening, no none of that. Understand?
Yes, ma'am.
Although I will say I'm all for strengthening.
I'm for strengthening, but we're not weakening. That's what we mean. It's no weakening with this bill, because you know how it could go behind a door and want to like carve it out. We're not going there. We're not going there, because then you got to come for the people.
Yeah. Well, talk about a mic drop. And as soon as you said that, I thought about my great ancestor, the one and only Malcolm X, by any means necessary. Black and brown people, we're not going to compromise anymore. We already saw what compromise gets us. I am in absolute agreement that with the Environmental Justice for All Act, we want it all. We're not going to compromise. We don't want a part of it. We don't want it broken up. We remember what happened. I'm just going to keep it real. We saw what happened to Build Back Better and how they built that out and broke it up. We don't want it in pieces. We want it whole. I'm going to echo what you said, Ms. Michelle. We want it whole. We want a whole access to a healthy and clean environment. So I told you this was going to be a phenomenal panel. We have come to an end of a fantastic episode of Green Table Talk. I'm so ecstatic that we are here in the Rayburn building. Let's shout out for that, being Black folks. This is a Black organization led by a Black woman in this space, right? So thank you so much for joining us. Those virtually, thank you so much for joining, and have a great rest of the day, y'all. Thank you.